Hey fellas, being President of the United States is a pretty dangerous job. Out of the 45 different presidents, 4 have been assassinated in office. But not all assassination attempts are successful, and today we're looking at the man behind America's first ever assassination attempt, and possibly the unluckiest assassin in history. Let's talk about Richard Lawrence. Born in 1801, Richard Lawrence was just your average guy for all of his early life. When he was 12, his family immigrated from England to the US, and as an adult, Richard worked as a house painter near Washington, D.C. And he wasn't the innuendo type of house painter from, like, The Irishman. Richard really was just the guy you would call up if you wanted your bedroom to become eggshell white. But something changed around Richard's 30th birthday. In November of 1832, Richard had a mental break, and he embarked on a spur-of-the-moment trip back to England, where he said he intended to stay. However, he returned only a month later, explaining to his family that it was just too cold to travel abroad, which was strange, but kind of understandable since it was November in England. What wasn't quite as understandable was that he then immediately traveled back to England to study landscape painting. This was the first clue that something was very wrong with Richard. It was made worse by the fact that he got fed up again with the English weather, causing him to return to the States. But instead of going home to DC, Richard went to Pennsylvania. Why? Who knows? But his time in Pennsylvania was important. He told his family that the newspapers were writing stories shaming his character and travel plans, and that the US government disapproved of him traveling back to England. He even claimed that mystery people were preventing him from going overseas. It was at this point that Richard became fixated on the government, and his anger started to grow. Running out of money in Pennsylvania, Richard was forced to return to DC in 1833, where he stayed with his sister and her husband. He told them that he needed to save up enough money to build a ship that could take him back to England, since the government was supposedly preventing him from traveling. The whole saving up money thing was very short-lived, because soon after returning to DC, Richard stopped working as a painter. In fact, he stopped working altogether. When his sister asked what he thought he was doing, Richard said that he was not just any ordinary Richard. No, our Richard thought that he was King Richard III of England, a monarch that ruled during the 1400s. Our Richard lived in the 1800s, so it was somewhat unlikely that Richard was right about his 400-year expired royal status. However, he remained under the delusion that he was King Richard III, and as such, he should be extremely rich, and he should be receiving profits from his American colonies. Now, obviously, the colonies weren't paying him any profits because they weren't colonies anymore, and Richard wasn't King Richard III. But Richard believed that the colonies should be paying him money, and the reason he wasn't being paid was due to the restrictions on the Second Bank of the United States. And who had put those restrictions on the Second Bank of the United States? Why, none other than reigning President Andrew Jackson. To us, all of this sounds like ridiculous ideas from a delusional mind, but to Richard, everything was clear-cut and simple. There was one reason he wasn't rich beyond his wildest dreams. There was one reason he couldn't travel to England where he was king. And there was one way he could fix all of his problems. Richard Lawrence needed to assassinate President Andrew Jackson. Friday, January 30th, 1835, was the perfect day for an assassination. It was dreary, misty, and overcast, and most of the politicians in Washington, D.C. were attending the funeral of a South Carolina representative at the Capitol building. Among the attending politicians was President Jackson, and among the crowd of attendees was his assailant, Richard Lawrence. As the funeral was ending, President Jackson walked by the pillar where Richard was standing. Suddenly, Richard whipped out a pistol and shot at the president, but the gun misfired. Luckily for Richard, he had a second pistol, which he pulled out once he realized that the first hadn't worked. Unluckily for Richard, President Jackson was now aware of the situation, and Jackson was no slouch. He began smacking Richard with his walking cane, and as Richard fell under attack, he tried to shoot his second pistol at the president, which misfired again. By now, everyone had realized what was going on, and Davy Crockett was able to separate the two men. The whole time, President Jackson was beating Richard senseless with his cane. And yes, it was that Davy Crockett who stopped the fight, the one with a whole Disney song about him. But it gets even better because for his trial, Richard was prosecuted by none other than Francis Scott Key, the very same Francis Scott Key who wrote the US national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Speaking of the trial, it went relatively smoothly, and Richard was absolved of all of his crimes due to his very obvious insanity. The only person who didn't think that the trial went smoothly was Andrew Jackson, who firmly believed that one of his political opponents had put Richard up to the assassination, and following the assassination attempt, Jackson was notably more paranoid. However, there is no evidence that anyone besides Richard was behind the attack, and it's pretty clear that Richard was going insane. For the rest of his life, Richard was forced to stay in various insane asylums and hospitals, and the entire time he believed that he was not Richard Lawrence, but rather King Richard of England. Needless to say, Richard never received any profits from his colonies, and the United States never gave him another chance at trying to take them. Richard Lawrence's assassination attempt on President Jackson was the first ever presidential assassination attempt, and it went remarkably poorly. The odds that both pistols misfired are unbelievably low, and it's a miracle that Andrew Jackson left the scuffle unscathed. The insanity behind the assassination is definitely a story worth telling. Alright fellas, get out of here.